All right, quickly, the outline of the second half of Mark. We've learned about the character of the kingdom. Right now I'm calling this the crisis of the kingdom, the judgment that is rendered, in a sense, in this kingdom moment. It began, as it were, yesterday, Sunday. Last week we looked at that. The king arrives for trial. Monday, the king puts Jerusalem on trial. Tuesday, he pronounces his sentence as a result of that trial. The fig tree, as I'm sure you're aware, is an object lesson which teaches us about what's actually happening in Jerusalem. It is a teaching object lesson, as was common among the prophets in Israel. And in this case, this fig tree stands for a much greater reality, which is in fact Jerusalem itself. So Jesus comes from Bethany, where he's been staying. He was hungry. It's Monday morning. He had been staying presumably at the home of Mary and Martha. Other gospel accounts tell us that. Mark does not. He was probably hungry because of prayer and fasting. That's what commentators tend to believe. He was a human being, and though he was God among us, nevertheless he limited himself humanly to the same kinds of limitations that we feel. He got hungry, he got tired, he got thirsty, and so on. He felt all of that, and so we're not surprised to hear that he was hungry. If you were in the class last year, you recall that we have these literary devices that are commonly called a Marquand sandwich, and this is clearly one of them. So we start with the cursing of the fig tree. We wind up a little later in the text with an explanation of what's going on with this cursing of the fig tree business. And in the meantime, we learn the point, which is the meat of the sandwich, and that is the corruption that is taking place in the temple, so that in a sense the fig tree points to the cursing of this systemic corruption there, which of course is going to be what Jesus himself will pronounce tomorrow, Tuesday, in our Holy Week drama. So Jesus sees from afar a tree having leaves. He went to see if perhaps he could find something on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, because it wasn't the season for figs. Fig trees were pretty common in that area. The name Bethphage, which is where he co-opted the donkey, you remember last week, literally means house of figs. They were everywhere. You could see them. Many prophecies in the Old Testament actually use the fig tree as an emblem, a sign of God's judgment. You'll find this in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Joel, and others. Many texts use the fig tree, and commonly it's used to stand for judgment. So, for example, Isaiah chapter 34, all the host of heaven shall be dissolved. The heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. All their host shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine, and as fruit falling from a fig tree. That was a pronouncement of judgment by Isaiah connected to Jerusalem. This is the background of a similar text in the book of Revelation, in which the author there is describing the judgment that would befall Jerusalem. Listen to these words. This is from Revelation chapter 6. I watched as he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red. The stars in the sky fell to earth as late figs dropped from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The sky receded like a scroll rolling up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Similar language applying, as Isaiah had years earlier, the prediction of judgments that would befall Jerusalem. The prophets, of course, often dramatize their message using object lessons, and so Jesus is doing something like that here. All right, well, there were many different species of fig trees in that region at that time. One of them produced what was called pagim. Pagim doesn't look very appetizing. I'm glad you can see it. It was very chewy, not very appetizing, but if you were really hungry, you might eat some of this. The peculiar aspect of pagim was that trees would begin, this particular species would begin to produce it very early, and he would sort of bunch on the branches like that. And then later, leaves would show up, and the leaves ordinarily told you that this pagim, this early fig, kind of unripe, chewy, but nevertheless, it would sustain you some, was present. So that was clearly the tree that Jesus spotted off in the distance. He saw the leaves, and so he goes over, hoping to find some of this pagim to chew on as he's heading into Jerusalem. Well, he examines the tree and found, of course, leaves, but no fruit. And it became the perfect image of what Jerusalem was going to look like. A lot of show, a lot of pretense, a lot of religious display, a lot of the kind of stuff that you would think is associated with a robust religious life, no fruit. And so the fig tree, of course, becomes a perfect sort of poetic image of what's going to take place in Jerusalem. It says it was not the season for figs. It sounds a little unfair, Jesus getting mad at the fig tree, and it wasn't even the season for figs. But the point Mark has in mind, and what he's expecting his readers to understand, was that it would be the season for pagim, you see, based on that particular species. So Jesus, responding to the situation, now does to the fig tree what is in fact going to be done in a vastly greater and more profound expression of God's wrath toward Jerusalem soon enough. And he pronounces this curse, "Let no one eat fruit from you ever again." His disciples heard it. This is a word of judgment to a fig tree, which is symbolizing the words of judgment Jesus will say soon enough in Jerusalem. Tuesday, the next day, when he renders his judgment, the pronouncement that Jesus is going to make soon enough will be in these words, "Therefore, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine dressers and give the vineyard to others." And, of course, the religious leaders are the target of that particular judgment language, and they knew it. And they sought to lay hands on him, but feared the multitude, for they knew that he had spoken the parable against them. So what Jesus does now with respect to a fig tree is a little overture, a little anticipation of what's going to take place later. It was a sentence, by the way, not pronounced against the Jewish people per se. That's been a horrible and highly misguided view, as you know, down through Christian history. It's been one of the most tragic things, a kind of anti-Semitic attitude that has come up occasionally related to the judgments that Jesus pronounces in Jerusalem. Remember, it was Jewish people who were the first converts. It was Jewish people who were the earliest believers. It was Jewish people who were the earliest missionaries to us Gentiles. We should be grateful and celebrate Jewish people. And the anti-Semitic attitudes that have come along from time to time, of course, have no place whatsoever in the life of faith. But it was a sentence of judgment against a corrupt leadership which had led the people astray, and many of them had followed willingly, and Jesus is now coming to give them the choice to pull back the mask and expose what's been happening, and to give people the opportunity to align themselves with the true and rightful ruler in Israel. And if they do so, they will enjoy his great benefits, and if they refuse to do so, they are going to face the consequences of those choices. The reason Mark mentions here the disciples heard it is because, of course, he wants us to know that this was pedagogical. Jesus wasn't just on a short fuse, you know. He wasn't just grumpy and got irritated at this fig tree and pronounced this judgment. It is the only judgment, the only miracle we have in the gospel accounts of what could be called a destructive miracle. It has been a bit of an embarrassment to Christian people and sometimes to Christian scholars down through history, because it makes Jesus look a little bit, bitter and short-tempered and that sort of thing. Bertrand Russell, of course, famously seized on this as one of the evidences that Jesus isn't such a wonderful guy. He said in his essay, "Why I Am Not a Christian," quote, "I cannot myself feel that either in the matter of wisdom or in the matter of virtue, Christ stands quite as high as some other people known to history." George Bernard Shaw said that Jesus didn't always live up to the standard of a Christian, which I've always thought was interesting. That's the only standard Bernard Shaw could come up with to compare Jesus to. But anyway, I hope that these little sort of carping criticisms don't move you much, because really I think what's going on here has a much more significant and legitimate purpose. There's never been a fig tree in history that has been so celebrated and so recognized, you see, as this poor fig tree that got cursed. So let's not feel too bad about the unfolding story. Well, the next part of it, they come to Jerusalem. He entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he wouldn't allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you've made it a den of robbers. When the chief priests and scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. When evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. So this, commonly called the cleansing of the temple, may not be the best title, but it's the common one, so I'll use it. Jesus follows the same path he did yesterday, Sunday. He winds up in Jerusalem, goes to the temple, but this time he doesn't simply look around. He actually begins to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, overturns the money changer tables, the seats of those who sold doves. This is Herod's temple. Look quick. I was there, snapped this with my digital camera. It was a nice sunny day. This is a kind of an artist's conception, probably pretty accurate based on quite exact descriptions we have of the temple. It was immense and grandiose. This was the temple that had been refurbished on a grand scale by Herod. Herod was not Jewish. He wanted to ingratiate himself to the Jewish people, so he married a Hasmonean princess, Mariamne. She was a legitimate Jewish royalty. And he did everything he could to make himself likable, including building this colossal temple, which was one of the wonders of the ancient world, according to Josephus. If you look at it, you see that this outer perimeter there, will be there eventually, is called the Court of the Gentiles. The Court of the Gentiles was a quadrangle by about 500 yards long and 325, there you got it, yards wide. So it's about 5 football fields in length, 325 in width. It basically took up 35 acres, this temple complex. It was enclosed by a wall, a portico, you can see there, and maybe you can see little columns. You see those little columns where the arrows are pointing? Those columns were each 35 feet high, almost 4 stories high. It took 3 men standing finger to finger, to reach around each of those columns. So it gives you an idea just how immense this structure was. The practice of selling animals for purposes of sacrifice did not originate in the Old Testament. It really came in the intertestamental period, in the post-exilic period. Up until then, most Jewish people had, as you know, lived in Jerusalem, or I should say lived in Israel, at least lived within a reasonable distance of Jerusalem. After the exile, most Jewish people, in fact, by far most Jewish people, lived outside of Israel. And thus, to go to Jerusalem for a Passover or for any other kind of festival was quite a bit more of an undertaking than would have been the case had they lived in Israel. And so, as a matter of convenience, rather than dragging along their own animals for purposes of sacrifice, they would take money. Usually money indigenous, to the region they lived, and they would show up. And when they showed up in Jerusalem, they would start buying animals for purposes of sacrifice. Well, the priestly class figured out pretty soon, whoa, there's gold in them there hills, And so they started opening a market in the vicinity of the temple to sell animals which had been pre-approved. You could only offer a certain kind of animal. It had to be an animal without blemish. It had to pass muster. It had to meet certain criteria. And so the priests would actually put their stamp of approval. This one is good. And gradually they moved that market inside the temple precincts into what's called the court of the Gentiles. By the time we reached the first century, this had become robust business on steroids. There was an immense amount of wealth that was pouring into the coffers of the Sanhedrin, I should say of the Sadducee class generally, who dominated the Sanhedrin. And then, of course, as people would show up to buy their animals, they would be told, oh, I'm sorry, you have the Persian derrick, or you have this or that currency. We can't use, that's unclean money. So you need to exchange it for the temple shekel. And they attached quite a markup to that. And so by the time all the dust had settled, the revenue stream to the priestly class was just astronomical. And the way in which the temple had become a money machine was almost more than a person could possibly have imagined. This was in some ways cynically referred to at the time. People understood what was going on, but what are you going to do? These are the folks that ran the temple, and in a sense there was nobody that could, do anything about it. That was pretty much their authority to do such a thing. The wealth that was created in Jerusalem by virtue of the operation of the temple created some of the most wealthy people in the ancient world in Jerusalem, not just in Israel, but in the whole Roman Empire. Some of the most wealthy, as we would say, billionaires of the time lived in Jerusalem, and they had created an immense consumer class of some of the most exotic goods that could be shipped in from around the world. And so there was in Israel at that point a very small, elite, super wealthy upper class. There was a vast lower class of people who lived in near poverty and sometimes in grinding poverty, and really not much of a middle class. And that's why in the New Testament you'll sometimes hear a diatribe against the rich. James especially is really brutal with the rich, and it makes you wonder, man, what's the problem here, But James is writing against the backdrop of the abuses of what had taken place in Israel. He's writing from a very Jewish perspective and representing that concern about that sort of opportunistic and exploitive use of religion to basically, build up your own wealth and so on. This trade that was carried on with the elite class in Jerusalem again finds some attention in the book of Revelation. Where you read in chapter 18 about the merchants of the earth who are weeping and mourning because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stone, and pearls, of fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cargoes of cinnamon and spice, incense, myrrh, and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses, carriages, and, trenchantly at the end, bodies and souls of men. This is what was being trafficked in Jerusalem, and every one of those products and many more has been documented as being part of what was being consumed by the upper elite class in Jerusalem at the time. And that's what got Jesus a little upset, you see, when he comes into the temple. Emil Schurer, a commentator on this, says, "This huge quantity of animals, so great as to be almost unbelievable, gave the temple cult its peculiar stamp. Day after day, masses of victims were slaughtered there and burnt, and in spite of the thousands of priests, when one of the great festivals came around, the multitude of sacrifices was so great, they could hardly cope with them." A little bit more on our tour. The beautiful gate you've heard of in the New Testament was the front door, really. From there you go into what was called the court of the women. There was a further door that took you into the court of the men, of circumcised Jewish males, and then finally, of course, the central sanctuary there in the middle. So this is kind of the layout. This is where Jesus arrives, and Mark tells us he began to cast out. The Greek word ekbalein, infinitive of ekbalo, to cast out. Our idiom would be to kick out. That's really the sense of the word. It implies violence, force. John tells us he was using a whip. We would say this was an act of civil disobedience, except this is the king. He's exercising his royal prerogatives at this point, so there's no civil disobedience to it. If anything, it's the money changers and the sellers of all this stuff that are the disobedient ones. But certainly what he's doing is disturbing the peace. Except that there wasn't much peace either, because this was a rowdy marketplace that was going on. But Jesus is going to call it to a halt. It's a direct assault on the temple authorities. It is calculated to provoke a crisis. It's not the first time in the history of Israel that you've got violence connected with protecting the integrity of the temple. In Nehemiah chapter 13, Nehemiah says, it grieved me bitterly. Therefore I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room. Then I commanded them to cleanse the rooms, and I brought back unto them the articles of the house of God, and the grain offerings, and the frankincense. Nehemiah himself being a little bit of a forerunner of the passions there of Christ on this occasion. The question might occur to you, if that was 35 acres of wide open marketplace and all of it was being used in this way, could Jesus really have brought the whole thing to a standstill? Was it really conceivable? And people have speculated about that. Jerome, that church father who translated the Bible into the Vulgate, said he believed Jesus did bring it to a halt, and he wrote on that topic, quote, a fiery splendor flashed from his eyes, and the majesty of deity shone in his countenance. And so, who knows, it may be that the whole thing kind of grinding to a halt as a result of Jesus' interruption of it. What were Jesus' objections? These are probably fairly obvious, but one commentator I thought put a sharp point on it. It was an improper place. The temple was for worship. Here it was being used for open marketing, hawking, souvenirs are being sold. You've got the step right up folks, this is your lucky day kind of deal going on. It's just a wide open Main Street marketplace in its operation. Horse trading, profiteering, all of this having taken place really in the post-exilic period. It was also an improper purpose, because now the temple and religious power is being used in order to acquire wealth. There's certainly a certain amount of money that it takes to run a religious operation. We understand that. But when it becomes its own source of revenue and just astronomical wealth is being accumulated on the backs of people who are trying to come and worship, then you realize something is not quite right in Denmark. And that seems to be Jesus' objections here as he's raising this this interruption to things. He wouldn't allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. Only Mark mentions this, but you realize that if you're running a store, then you have to have somebody that supplies, like your wholesale kind of deal. And there in that region, the priests had given special permission to beasts of burden, so that you got all of these tramping through, delivering new supplies to all of the concessionaires out there. And so the whole thing is just kind of a wide open street market kind of deal. Noisy, probably a little smelly. If you can just imagine in your mind's eye kind of what was going on, that's the atmosphere of what's happening. This is cross-examination. Jesus asked, this is the trial, you see. He's gathering evidence now, preparing to render his verdict tomorrow, Tuesday. He asked them the question, isn't it written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for the nation? You've made it a den of thieves. It is, of course, telling that this text that Jesus cites begins by using the expression, my house, my house. God is speaking. The house of God does not belong to us. It belonged to God. We could say something like that about our sanctuary. We walk into that sanctuary to worship. Some of you already have, some of you will in a little while. We are walking into space that is ultimately not owned by us. It's not a deed somewhere, recorded down to the county. It is owned by God. And so we are entering at His invitation into His house. And if you got invited over to your neighbor's house, for supper, and you walked in the front door and said, wow, those are ugly curtains. Whoa, and who got that painting? That's off. And began insulting the house. It doesn't take long for the owner to figure out you're insulting the owner. And when these people were just, in a sense, spitting in the face of Almighty God, running this trafficking of all of this stuff in the very presence of the house that is owned by Him, of course, in some ways, this has to be construed as an insult to God Himself. This house, which is supposed to be a place of worship, was a house of prayer for the nations. For the nations. Jewish thought at the time was that Messiah would eventually clear the temple of Gentiles. Jesus actually clears it for Gentiles. And the text that he cites here from Isaiah makes that point clearly enough. Also, the sons of the foreigner, Isaiah writes, who joined themselves to the Lord to serve Him and to love the name of the Lord, to be His servants, everyone who keeps from defiling the Sabbath and holds fast my covenant, even them I will bring into my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. This is God speaking of the Gentiles. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifice will be accepted on my altar, because my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. The Lord God, who gathers the outcasts of Israel, says, yet I will gather to Him others, that is Gentiles, besides those who are gathered to Him. There is a kind of design to worship in the Old Covenant setup, which changed dramatically with the New Covenant. In the Old Covenant, the temple, you might say in our nomenclature, was the world's church. You see, it was the neighborhood church for the world. The world was the church's parish. That was the design, a central sanctuary, a central place of worship, not just for Jewish people, but for all people, to come and find themselves in the presence of the true God of heaven and earth. Jerusalem was therefore, in a sense, the capital of the world. It was the holy city. It was there that God had placed His name, and Israel was denominated a priestly nation, a nation of priests. Repeatedly, Israel is given that term because they were, in a sense, the pastor nation. Israel was supposed to lead the nations in worship and to cause them to recognize the true God in Israel and to act in a kind of priestly role. Pilgrimage, therefore, was legitimate in the Old Covenant operation, because a pilgrimage meant a journey from a less holy place to a more holy place. And so pilgrimage took place, and it was legitimized. The Psalms of Ascent, for example, in the book of Psalms, celebrate this sort of thing. Jesus comes and really turns everything upside down. The New Covenant has a very different design to it. And really the beginning of this New Covenant structure begins as He's setting aside the Old Testament, the Old Covenant kind of arrangement. So now in the New Testament, the temple is a living building. It is an organism. It is not concrete and mortar. It is made up of what the New Testament calls living stones, and those living stones happen to be you and me, who are also called in the New Covenant era priests. The most extensive statement on this, of course, from 1 Peter, coming to Him as a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious, you also are living stones, being built up to a spiritual house. That's temple language. A holy priesthood. That's why Luther got excited about the idea, the priesthood of all believers, because that's how the New Testament regards us who are living stones in this temple. We offer spiritual sacrifices accepted to God through Jesus Christ. The Old Covenant contemplated bloody sacrifices of animals. Those have stopped. But sacrifice continues. The sacrifices now that are being offered are sacrifices we offer in the spirit of what Paul says in Romans, when he says, I beg you, brothers and sisters, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. We are the sacrifices now. We're the priests, we're offering it, and we're the temple. All of this is sort of localized in God's people in the New Covenant arrangement. You're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Jesus is going to say on Tuesday of this week, the kingdom is taken from you and given to a nation worthy of it. We are that nation, Jew and Gentile. We become that nation not by ethnicity, we become that nation by faith in Christ. And it's faith in Christ that makes us that nation, a special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, now you are the people of God, had not obtained mercy, now you've obtained mercy. It's a different temple, you see. We don't have a temple as Christians. It makes me a little uncomfortable when I hear churches call themselves a temple. You know, this or that temple. We don't have a temple. A temple says that's where God is and you can't find him elsewhere. You are the temple. That's what the New Testament says. You are the temple of God. He resides in you. There's a different Jerusalem now. The New Testament contemplates a different Jerusalem from a city over in the Middle East. I know there's a city over in the Middle East called Jerusalem, but that's not the Jerusalem of the New Testament. Listen to Paul's words in Galatians chapter 3, referring to the city of Jerusalem there. He says, Hagar's Mount Sinai in Arabia corresponds to the Jerusalem which now is and is bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. For it's written, rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear. We are now in this new Jerusalem that Paul is describing. Hebrews does the same thing, chapter 12. You have come to the true Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, and so on. The book of Revelation, of course, famously celebrates a new Jerusalem as it describes the setting aside of the old. This is the nature of this new covenant paradigm for worship. A new temple, a living city, as it were. Pilgrimage is now reversed. You know, it's fine to go to the Holy Land, but we should never call it a pilgrimage, kind of a formal sense. If there's any pilgrimage at all, it's the pilgrimage that God's people are making to the world. Jesus says to his disciples, you go to the world and make disciples of them in the name of King Jesus, because that is now the nature of this kingdom, to grow and expand so that Jerusalem is everywhere in this world. The temple is everywhere in this world. Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, there I'm going to be in the midst. So we have something rather dramatic that's beginning to unfold as Jesus is going to render his judgment in connection with that temple. He calls what's happening there a den of thieves. It's actually the Greek word that would mean robbers. Thieves operate surreptitiously, secretly. Robbers are a little bit more upfront, a little more violent, a little bit more rapacity and extortion, and that's the word he uses here. This is kind of a word implying sort of forcible, violent kinds of robbery. The scribes and the chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him. For they feared him because all the people were astonished at his teaching. Interestingly, the Pharisees are not mentioned here. We've mentioned before that in ancient Israel's religion there was the temple-centric and the Torah-centric branches. The Sadducees were more, the priests were more the temple-centric, the Pharisees more the Torah-centric. Both of them are treated to fairly stern criticism from Jesus. But at this point, I think the Pharisees might have been standing back a little bit amused at this, because they didn't like the Sadducees very much. They didn't like these people making all the money off the temple so much, and so maybe they felt common cause with Jesus at that point. In any event, they were all seeking how they might destroy him. The word for destroy, apolesosen, means to just wipe out. It's a very strong. They wanted to get rid of this man and his memory and everything they could possibly think of. But they feared the people. FDR, you may, not because any of you are that old, but you may remember from studying history, once said that Huey Long was the most dangerous man in America. He was kind of like our version of Hitler, getting some traction, and people were listening, and FDR was a little worried about the amount of traction that he was getting. Happily for FDR, somehow or other, an assassin took out Huey Long. We've never quite known who arranged that. But nevertheless, Huey Long, I think, was probably a force for evil. Jesus was a comparable force for good, even more so. And just as FDR feared Huey Long, these people feared Jesus because Jesus was the most dangerous man in Israel. And in fact, Jesus was the most dangerous man in the world. And they kind of saw what was coming. Jesus is a dangerous man, you see. He is not to be domesticated. We should never try to put him in some sort of neat container where we've got Jesus just where we want him. He will never be just where you want him. He will put you where you need to be sometimes, but to try to tame him is getting yourself into a very fearsome situation. The people, of course, are astonished, stunned. The word means as if hit by a blow, in shocked amazement. Well, when evening came, he went out of the city. This was what's called a visitation. It's a technical idea of an inspection, an assessment, a trial. In fact, Jesus himself says in Luke, in the related context, they will not leave in you one stone upon another because you did not know the time of your visitation. This was it. Jesus showing up to visit, to inspect. It is exactly what Malachi, in one of the last prophecies of the Old Testament, had predicted. The Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Even the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he's coming, says the Lord, but who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? He's like a refiner's fire, like a launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the sons of Levi and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer to the Lord an offering in righteousness. From there he went back to Bethany. This is probably less a cleansing of the temple, as more in the spirit of John the Baptist, a laying of the axe to the root of the temple. It's a little bit closer to what's actually going on. It's not a restoration, it's a dissolution. Remember, Friday of this same week, the temple veil is going to be torn in two. The deepest structure of the temple will be removed right there. The rest of it's going to go away in just a few years. This is Jesus pronouncing doom on this operation, not simply cleaning house. A new and living temple is going to be built. Christ himself is the chief cornerstone. We are stones in this temple, and that's what's happening in the beginning of this. All right. This is the rest of the story, the rest of the fig tree. How's it doing? Are we getting mostly pictures up there? I haven't been able to see. Okay, good. You're very patient. I appreciate it. Here's the last little bit on the fig tree. In the morning as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away at its roots. Peter remembered and said to him, "Look, Rabbi, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, it will be yours. Whenever you pray, whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses." So now we revisit the fig tree and really what is going on here. They get up in the morning, they pass by. It's Tuesday morning now, so I'm creeping into the next morning. We'll pick up, of course, more of this next week. The fig tree is dried up from its roots. It completes the fig tree imagery that we saw earlier. Peter looks at it. The fig tree which you cursed is withered away. Stands, of course, for a temple that's going to wither away. And so the fig tree that started looking pretty good is going to become this dry, leafless, barren plant. And then this very interesting phrase, your Greek lesson for the day, ekata pistin theou. Ekata is the imperative of you have, so it means have, a command. Pistin, faith. Now here's what's unusual and has been commented on many times by close commentators. Usually in the New Testament, to say faith in God would be pistin eis theon, faith in God, or literally faith into God. Here, that's not what he says. It's faith of God. It's the genitive case. Have the faith of God. And it seems that this kind of unusual construction is saying something along the line of you have the confidence that originates in God in you. Have that confidence that God plants in you, safely residing in you, reflecting the faithfulness of God with respect to what? the assaults that you are going to be experiencing in the not too far distant future. Jesus is going to be murdered by the end of the week. The disciples are going to be in some peril themselves. And what Jesus wants to tell them is, in spite of the judgments he's pronouncing and the wrath that's going to be sparked as a result of it, they who will seem to be in peril, nevertheless, are going to be protected, and they need to have that confidence in their hearts that can only come from God. Jesus says, "Assuredly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be removed and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that those things he says will be done, he will have whatever he says." This mountain, of course, is not just any mountain. It's the mountain they were looking at that moment. It's Mount Zion. It's the Temple Mount. It's the place from which the persecution would emanate. Because in the first place, the persecution of Christian people came at the hands of Jewish authorities. Long before Rome got into the picture, it was persecution mounted by Jewish folks, and the New Testament, of course, documents that in a great deal of detail, as you're aware. So the first great enemy of the Christian movement was the entrenched official Jewish religion. It crucified Christ. The book of Acts tells us it began harassing his followers, driving them out of Jerusalem, and Jesus needs to give these folks a word of encouragement that this mountain, which is the very heart from which that persecution is launched, is nevertheless going to be, as it were, cast into the sea. Just have this confidence that God gives you. The text being cast into the sea is borrowed from Jeremiah. Jeremiah concludes his prophecies about Babylon, saying to Baruch, his associate, when he goes and preaches a sermon in Babylon, "When you finish reading this book, you shall tie it to a stone and throw it into the Euphrates, and you shall say, 'Thus Babylon shall sink and not rise from the catastrophe that I will bring upon her. They shall be weary.' Thus far are the words of Jeremiah." That's exactly the language, of course, that once again Revelation picks up and applies to the Babylon in her target, which is Jerusalem itself. And we read in Revelation, "Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, 'With such violence the great city, Babylon, Jerusalem, shall be thrown down and shall not be found anymore.'" This is a word of encouragement to them with respect to what's happened with this fig tree. Later that day, Tuesday, Jesus is going to say as much to the religious leaders. "Your house is left to you desolate," he'll say, "a desert, dried up. Not one stone will be left upon another. All is going to be thrown down, as it were, all is going to be thrown into the sea." So Jesus says, okay, guys, whatever you ask, when you pray, believe that you'll receive it and you will have it. In the face of this withering persecution you're going to face, being harassed from here to there. Some guy named Saul of Tarsus is going to give you so much grief until I convert him, you know. You're just going to be facing this constantly, but in all of this, have faith, trust me. It's a promise for God's people from their past attacks there in Jerusalem. For Mark's audience, it was a promise because they were facing persecution, not from the Jewish folks now so much, but from Nero. And it's a promise, of course, for us that God has given through Christ for all of us as well. When you pray, he says, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. It seems like an unexpected note there, but of course, when you're being persecuted for your faith, it's easy to become a little bitter. It's easy to be bitter anyway. But sometimes when it seems completely undeserved, it can be even more tempting to develop a kind of grudge. And so Jesus wants us to know that this mountain will be cast into the sea, that his judgments are sure and certain, but he doesn't want any of us to fall into the trap of a kind of bitter-spirited attitude toward those who may in fact be the very ones giving us a bad time. So he warns that we should be those who, even as we pray for that mountain to be cast into the sea, are nevertheless doing that in a spirit of forgiveness. The first Christian martyr, Stephen, was probably stoned by some of the people who heard Jesus saying these words in the temple within a few months. And Stephen could have been pretty upset. Well, you bunch of dummies, you know. And he could have really been angry, but what does he say? Father, forgive them. Forgive them. Don't lay this sin to their charge. This is the Christian spirit that has dominated the best of the Christian conscience down through history. Some of your Bibles have this concluding verse. It was not in Mark's original. It was tucked in there by a copyist later. It's certainly good law in the New Testament, but probably not included by Mark. If you don't forgive, neither will your Father in heaven forgive you. All right, I'm just there. Sunday school lesson 1. Religious show is always easier and more profitable than Christian virtue. You know, it's easy to do a religious show. It looks impressive. It doesn't amount to much. James makes a comment in the first chapter of his book. If anyone among you thinks he is religious and doesn't bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, his religion is worthless. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to care for orphans and widows in their distress. That's the affirmative duty of Christians. Christians have an affirmative duty to do things that matter, not just strut their religious stuff. And to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. That's the negative command, to avoid getting sucked in to the self-centered narcissism of this world, but to always be living in the ethic of a concern for those who are in need. Second, worship is not a means but an end, and the atmosphere of worship should always be guarded. We have a wonderful center for worship, as you know, in our sanctuary. I love that room. It's one of my favorite rooms in the world. It's a wonderful place to worship. And there is a kind of spirit of worship that should accompany us as we go into that space. We are being invited into the very house of God. And as guests there, invited to share in fellowship with Him, there's a kind of protocol that is appropriate for being in that place. And Jesus' criticism in some ways of what was happening in that temple setting teaches us a lesson about what we should be doing in our centers of worship. And finally, the protective grace of God frees His people to forgive rather than retaliate in the face of a hostile world.